Talk a little bit about juveniles in the registry, if you would.
Sure. Juveniles on the registry has been probably one of the more contentious issues around the Adam Walsh Act and SORNA. For the first time in the federal Adam Walsh Act, a juvenile disposition was included in the definition of what a conviction for a sex offense is. And so the federal Adam Walsh Act and the initial guidelines that were given for SORNA said that you had to include kids age 14 and older who were convicted of certain offenses on the internet registry. There was a lot of resistance to that. Those federal guidelines had a public comment period, and they received literally hundreds of public comments in opposition to the juvenile inclusion. It was a big battle in Ohio. We were able to convince the Ohio legislature to back down and only include a very small number of kids on the internet registry. But then since then, the federal government has released a new set of supplemental guidelines that back down even further. And now under the supplemental guidelines, no juveniles who go through the normal juvenile court process, who don't go through the adult criminal court, are required to be on the internet registry. A state can still be in compliance with SORNA if they put the juveniles only on a law enforcement only registry that includes no internet notification or community notification. So it's definitely been progress in the right direction on the juvenile issue as far as what states are required to do. But even creating and maintaining a non-public registry is a big step for a lot of states, because there are several states that have no juvenile registry whatsoever.
So how many kids annually would you estimate are prosecuted as juveniles for sex offenses?
Oh, it's hard to say. I mean, it's found many thousands across the country.
And are these like hardcore sex offenses that these kids are committing?
Very rarely. I mean, you do have, obviously, there are some forcible rape cases in juvenile court that are what I think people traditionally think of as rape cases. But much more often with juveniles, it's consensual activity, and when the parents find out about it, the parents worry and report the activity to authorities. A lot of times it literally can be what I think we would normally think of more as horseplay, and a boy grabbing a girl in the school hallway. And while inappropriate, it's the kind of behavior that in the past would be dealt with within the school and within the family, and that now we've turned to prosecution of and criminalize that kind of behavior that I think is more kind of normal adolescent behavior.
Mm-hmm. Of course, when we talk about these things, we talk a lot about child safety. Do you think most parents realize how easy it would be for their son or daughter to be convicted as a sex offender?
Absolutely not. Not until they get caught up in it, I think. People are astonished, the people that I've talked to whose kids have been on the registry. A lot of them reported their kids. A lot of them realized that their kids were participating in some kind of activity that they thought was inappropriate, and the parents themselves went to the authorities and said, here's what my son has done, or here's what my daughter has done. And they did so because they had faith in the system, and they thought that they were doing the right thing by reporting the behavior, and that the right thing would happen, that their kid would get some treatment, that if there was a victim, that the victim would get whatever kind of treatment that the victim needed. And instead they have found themselves just spun completely out of control, losing their kids, losing any kind of authority over what their kids need to do and what they don't, and finding that this activity has really been criminalized. So absolutely, I don't think that parents understand what's going to happen. I've had parents tell me themselves that if they had to do it all over again, they would never report the activity.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of negative consequences do you think that all these restrictions on sex offenders have? I mean, we want to track these people supposedly, but what kind of maybe unintended consequences does the registry and does all this legislation pose?
All kinds of unintended consequences. I mean, the registry affects not just the people who have to go on the registry, but it affects their families and their friends and their employers and their communities. A fair number of sex offenses, especially when we're talking about juvenile sex offenses, happen within the family. And so if you have a son and a daughter, the son may be offended on the daughter. when you identify that son, when you put him on a registry, when you put his information out there publicly, essentially what you're doing is also putting the victim out there publicly. And I don't think anybody wants to do that, but you're putting her on stage too. There are other unintended, or maybe intended, but consequences of the registry. It's nearly impossible to find housing for a lot of offenders. It's nearly impossible to find employment. I don't think that's what anybody wants. I don't think anybody wants to take somebody who's committed a sex offense and make them unemployed and homeless and living on the streets, but that's really the effect that the registry has on a lot of folks. So it's not that we're just affecting people who have been convicted of sex offenses. We're really having a negative impact on families, on communities, and eventually I think on the economy, because when you put this scarlet letter on tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people and you make them unemployable, what effect is that going to have on our economy? Certainly not a good one.
And finally, you talked a little bit about the backlash of those, maybe people don't realize, but states and tribes, that Indian tribes that don't comply. What do you think is going to happen as a result of these tribes and others not complying? Because, well, I guess first of all, there are very few states that have actually, or jurisdictions that have actually complied. Is that correct?
Right. Only, I think, 24 jurisdictions have complied out of 254, I think. So now that we are past the final deadline, we've gotten to the point where there's going to have to be some sort of action taken by the federal government against the jurisdictions that have not complied. What the law says is that for jurisdictions that don't comply, states and territories risk losing 10% of their burn grant money. So all of those states that haven't complied, supposedly soon, will start losing federal grant money. For tribes that don't comply, the consequences are even more severe, I think, arguably. Tribes that don't comply lose their sovereignty over this issue, which means that they no longer would have the authority to regulate registries, and they would lose that authority to the state that the tribal land is in. And it's especially ironic if the tribe is located within a state that itself is not in compliance with SORNA. The tribe would risk losing sovereignty to a non-compliant state. Both of those things, the grant money and the sovereignty, are very important issues. And I think that when we get to the point that the federal government is going to either start holding back money or doing whatever it needs to do in order to transfer sovereignty from a tribe to a state, you're going to see this issue come to the forefront again. Because up until now, there's always been the threat of these things happening, but it hasn't actually happened yet. And I think that's kind of where the rubber meets the road. When the state is expecting a check and doesn't get the check, or when the tribe suddenly can't do can't exercise its sovereign power and loses that power to the state, those are real consequences for those jurisdictions. And I think that you'll see this issue come up again because those jurisdictions aren't going to like losing the money or losing that sovereignty.
And just, as a side consequence, what will that do to the court system in those areas?
It could really bog the courts down. I mean, it depends on what the states do or what the tribes do. I would assume that there are tribes out there that would file lawsuits over this loss of sovereignty. We'll just have to wait and see what happens about how much litigation there is, where that litigation happens, and what the outcomes are.